Oh wait, do I go the opposite way here? Yeah. Smart. SMRT. I don't know about you guys, but this is making me feel a little bit funky. Better, yeah, you know, that is the kind of the bind that we're in the mental health field. It's like my job's to work myself out of one. If people are doing well, then I'm not really needed. But you know, that fuels that whole like stigma. By the way, I'm just only saying that just because like that fuels the stigma a lot of times when people say, oh yeah, therapists don't want people to do well because they want to keep their jobs. I mean, I would much rather everybody in the world be doing well mentally if that means me having to find a different job. Like, I'm totally okay trading that off. It's such a ridiculous argument. Like, there are so many people in the world that, like, I don't need them all to be struggling all at once. It's just like, when you struggle, I'm here. Honestly, I think the thing that's going to stop stigma of mental health is two things. The first thing I think is going to, would at least lessen it, would be to have accurate representation of mental health and mental health treatment, which I know I've soapboxed about a lot. But being able to see in the mainstream what it looks like to go to therapy, having people who are in the spotlight talk about therapy and say things like, hey, take care of your mental health, it's cool to do that. I go to therapy myself, I do this, I do that. Like having that out in the mainstream, having more representation of what therapy actually looks like, which is hard to do, or getting rid of shitty representation of therapy, like things like Dr. Phil. But I also think one of the things that ends mental health stigma is if insurance companies get on board with treating mental illness like they do physical illness. Like that's kind of a big one, because a lot of people don't have as much access to mental health because their insurance companies aren't particularly fond of reimbursing for mental health. Like it's almost like insurance companies don't take it seriously, and so then it's hard for people to take it seriously because they have to ignore it or it's not out there. Like if more insurance companies would reimburse at rates that made it worthwhile for therapists to be on their panels as a show that they take it seriously, or if we had a single payer like healthcare in the United States that actually paid attention to mental health and cared, then that would, I think, minimize some of the stigma too, because people would see that it's something that's taken seriously in more of a global sense. And then if they know a bunch of people that see a therapist and it becomes more ubiquitous, I think that reduces some of the stigma. So that'd be my answer to that. I mean, I think it's interesting that he thinks that mental health is like this big construct that becomes significantly constraining for people. I mean, but the thing is, like, when he existed, when he was putting his ideas out there, I think people were really unsophisticated about the way that they understood mental health. So, for me, like, it makes sense for the time that was his heyday. I think we've become a lot more sophisticated about the way that we understand mental illness, and I think we can link mental illness at this point to, like, issues with the brain. In the same way that, like, you could look at other organs and say that when something's up with... like if something's wrong with your liver, there's a manifestation of that. I think it's the same thing for, by the way, thank you for the follow, Chris. I think it's the same way with the brain. Like if something's, it's not like the brain is exempt from having biological issues that then have certain manifestations that are behavioral or that are physical. And so you could say that mental illness is to some extent a manifestation of what's going on in the brain. So I don't know that I like fully jump on board with the idea that like mental illness is just this like completely social construct that we use as a means to like manipulate and control and determine what's right and wrong and normal and not normal. At the same time, there is some level of social construction to psychology and to mental illness in the sense that like we just have to have close approximations and look for patterns of manifestation. Most of those manifestations being in behavior, like the DSM is, I mean, very much behavioral, as well as like, I mean, meaning focused, but meaning doesn't get operationalized other than through language, which ends up being an action. And so like, yes, there is some like, I think guessing that's happened based on like patterns and stuff. But, you know, whether I don't know. I think just like I think he needed to take a polarizing view in order to like distinguish himself and make sure that his ideas are out there. And I'm not opposed to that. But I think that like, I don't know. I think his ideas are cool because it keeps everybody in check. But they also can be limiting in the sense that like, I think we've come a long way since when he was really putting those out there. Really sit down and think about it. Research design is not easy. There's a common misconception that designing studies and like doing research is something like, oh, well, we could just like research this. And like, that is not at all the case. Like, doing research is very hard. Designing good research, even harder. Like, that's why whenever you read a research study, you should be looking at the methods and the way that methods were described, because methods are what will tell you whether a study was well done or not. Not the results, not the discussion, methods. Shut up. That's the second time. Holy shit. This is what I mean, dude. My brain overdoes it. I'm sitting here going Theodore instead of saying Theodore. You guys, just shut up. Don't even worry about this. Don't even worry about me being a dum-dum right here. Oh, come here. Give me my army. Yeah. Woo, baby. I absolutely do. Right there. Oh, bam. 3, 2, 1. Oh, yeah. Yes. Take that, Cave Johnson. Take that. This is what I just did to Cave Johnson's puzzle. Splatter. But one of the things I think that's really important to remember anytime we talk about motivation is that motivation is fleeting. Motivation is not something that we can necessarily just drum up. And in the times where we don't feel motivation, it's really important to fill that with discipline. So if you wait for motivation to do things that you feel like you really need to do or really want to do, then you may not end up doing them, and then it's going to compound itself because you're going to feel really bad about not doing it. And so if you can have discipline, which is basically doing something in the absence of motivation because that's what you want to do, that can sometimes be really important and help you get through it. How more or less receptive do you find patients to be to therapy if their age increases? Honestly, Tree Hugger, I don't know that there's any correlation between age and like ability to engage in therapy. I mean, really what it comes down to is how open the person is to the process. I mean, like, because people come to therapy at various stages of change in terms of like their willingness to like engage in change and really like look at their accountability. And I don't think you can really put an age on that in terms of people's openness to that. So I will say that from a brain science perspective though, that as people get older, like really after about 30 years old, as you go throughout your life, as people get older, it becomes significantly more difficult to accommodate when dissonance is happening, and so change becomes a bit harder because the brain struggles a lot more with it. And so I think sometimes it could be maybe a little bit of a slower process with people who are older, simply from a brain science perspective, but even still, I don't know that I would say that being older or younger is going to have any effect on how well therapy is going to go. It's mostly your readiness for change. Smoking is when you smoke the cigarette, you get rewarded. Like, smoking the cigarette is its reward. And so not smoking is like a really horrible punishment for people who smoke. And so the thing is, like, you want to make sure that not smoking all of a sudden becomes the rewarding behavior as opposed to smoking the cigarette. So if you can replace that, it can make a difference. In family therapy, for example, there's a lot of models, and I actually teach the models class at Northwestern. And the thing about models is that when model creators were developing models, they do build off of the models that preceded them. At the same time, in order for them to distinguish themselves from the other models, they had to be more like out there and entrenched in whatever position it was that they were taking. So they would go to extremes to some extent so that people would pay attention. And so they would have to talk about their models in these like very holistic, not necessarily exaggerated ways, but like they really had to distinguish themselves from what's out there. And so what happens is sometimes they'll like become limited by taking the extreme view instead of realizing that they're borrowing from elsewhere and that they're all just kind of putting things together. The thing is, when you're a child, actually what's really interesting is learning it tends to be less stressful for children than it is for adults, because the child's brain accommodates a lot easier. For adults brains, the accommodation is a much harder way to resolve dissonance. And so what happens when you're a kid is new novel information is more interesting and is like, and yeah, like we tend to remember novelty, and novelty makes time feel like it's moving slower. And so as you become an adult, you are able to assimilate so many more things because you've learned so many things, and there's less novelty in adulthood, which is why time moves so much faster, because our brain can autopilot. And there's relativity. But yeah, like kids handle the stress of learning way better than adults do. And so adults just need to know that that's what's going to happen. It's just going to be harder for you to learn this. It's not that you can't. You just have to unlearn a lot of things when you're an adult in order to learn something, as opposed to a child who doesn't necessarily have to unlearn things. They can just learn different things. You're going to unlearn bad habits. You can unlearn certain skills, right? Like the idea that like when you're a child, it's really easy to it's easier to get a child to learn how to engage in positive self-talk, because there's probably not too much they have to unlearn in terms of like self-blaming patterns. Whereas an adult, if you've spent most of your life with like self-defeating patterns of internal cognition, me talking to a person about how do you all of a sudden start being a lot nicer to yourself and more compassionate is a skill they have to first unlearn, how to like being nasty to themselves and that kind of sequence of self-talk, and then they have to learn the new sequence. It's basically a replacement sequence. That's a lot harder for adults than it is for children. But yes, we tend to remember things in the context of novelty, and for children, everything's novel. Whereas for adults, less things are novel. Because I think sometimes for a lot of us, it's really easy to tell other people that they matter, right? To say you matter sometimes is really much easier than saying I matter. And so I would encourage you, anytime you feel compelled to tell a person that they matter or that their experiences are valid, do yourself a solid and say it to yourself too, okay? Because I think it's really important to walk the walk with that. And so it's awesome to tell people they matter. Remind yourself that you matter too.